I reclaimed my farm that had been taken by the HOA and decided to throw a party. I invited the whole family, but no one came. They were out shopping at the mall. After celebrating alone, my son sent me a message. "We need to talk about the property. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought victory could taste so bitter. After 3 long years of fighting the HOA, 3 years of lawyers and court dates and sleepless nights, I finally had my farm back. The deed was in my hands again, signed and sealed, but as I stood in my empty kitchen staring at the table set for 12 people, I felt more alone than I had in my entire 64 years of life. The barbecue was perfect. I'd spent the whole morning preparing it: slow-cooked brisket, my famous dry rub that took me years to perfect, corn on the cob, potato salad made from my late mother's recipe. The beer was ice cold in the cooler, and I'd even bought one of those fancy cakes from the bakery in town, the kind with real buttercream frosting that costs $37 but tastes like heaven. I'd called everyone. Paul, my son, was the first one I reached out to. "Dad, that's great news about the farm," he'd said, his voice sounding distracted like he was checking his phone while we talked. "We'll definitely be there. Can't wait to celebrate with you." Then I called my brother Mike, my sister Janet, even reached out to some cousins I hadn't spoken to in months. They all said the same thing. They'd be there. They were proud of me. This was such wonderful news. For the first time in years, I felt like I might actually have my family back. The morning of the party, I woke up at 5 a.m. even though I didn't need to. I was too excited to sleep. I kept imagining how it would feel to have the house full again, to hear laughter echoing through these rooms that had been too quiet for too long. I pictured Paul bringing his kids, maybe finally letting me be the grandfather I'd been trying to be. I imagined Janet telling her stories that always made everyone laugh until their sides hurt. By noon, everything was ready. The tables were set up on the back porch overlooking the pasture where I used to keep horses before all this legal mess started. I'd even hung string lights, the kind that make everything look warm and magical. The whole place looked like something out of a magazine. 1 o'clock came and went. No cars in the driveway. I told myself they were probably running late. Families with kids always are. By 2 o'clock, I started checking my phone, thinking maybe I'd missed some calls or texts. Nothing. The ice in the cooler was starting to melt, and the brisket was getting dry even though I'd wrapped it in foil. At 3:30, I finally broke down and called Paul. It went straight to voicemail. I tried Janet next, then Mike. All voicemails. My hands started shaking as I dialed number after number, getting the same electronic greeting over and over again. Finally, around 4 o'clock, Janet picked up. I could hear noise in the background, music, chatter, the sound of a crowd. "Oh, Dennis," she said, and I could hear the fake cheerfulness in her voice immediately. "How's the party going?" "Where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Everyone was supposed to be here at 1. There was a pause, and then she laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh people make when they're uncomfortable. "Oh, honey, didn't Paul tell you? We all decided to meet up at the mall instead. They're having this big sale, and you know how the kids love the arcade there. We figured you wouldn't mind." The phone felt heavy in my hand. "You figured I wouldn't mind? Well, you know, celebrations don't have to be at a specific place, right? We're all thinking of you." I could hear Paul's voice in the background, saying something to someone about a store closing soon. They hadn't even told me they weren't coming. They'd just decided my victory party wasn't worth their time and made other plans. "Janet," I said slowly, "I spent all morning cooking for 12 people. I bought a cake. I set up tables." Another pause. "Oh, well, maybe we can stop by later if we have time." They didn't have time. I knew they wouldn't have time. I hung up without saying goodbye and stood there in my kitchen, staring at all that food, at the cake with "Congratulations, Dennis," written in blue frosting, at the 12 empty chairs arranged around tables that would never be filled. I ended up eating alone on the back porch as the sun started to set. The brisket was actually pretty good, even if it had gotten a little dry. The beer was still cold. I tried to focus on the view, my view, on my land that nobody could take away from me anymore. But it was hard to feel victorious when victory felt so much like defeat. I was cleaning up the dishes, wrapping up pounds of leftover food that would take me weeks to eat, when my phone buzzed with a text message. Paul's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment my heart lifted. Maybe he was calling to apologize, to explain, to say they were on their way after all. But when I opened the message, the words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Hey Dad, we need to talk about the property. Can you call me tomorrow?" I didn't sleep that night. Paul's message kept playing in my head like a broken record. "We need to talk about the property. Not sorry we missed your party, Dad. Missed. And not congratulations on getting your farm back. Just business. Always business with him now." Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling fan that squeaked just like it had for the past 15 years, my mind drifted back to how this whole nightmare started. It was hard to believe it had only been 3 years since Martha, my ex-wife, decided she needed to teach me a lesson about what happens when you don't give her everything she wants. The divorce had been ugly, but I thought we'd at least been civil about the property. We'd agreed that I'd keep the farm. After all, I'd bought it with money I'd saved from 23 years of working double shifts at the steel mill. Every acre of this 160-acre spread represented sweat and sacrifice. Martha had never wanted to live here anyway. She'd always complained about being too far from town, too far from her friends, too isolated. But Martha was smart in ways I'd never given her credit for. She knew exactly how to hurt me where it would matter most. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I got my first letter from the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. It was polite but firm, informing me that my property had been found in violation of several community standards. Apparently, my barn was aesthetically inconsistent with neighborhood expectations. My vegetable garden was inappropriately located within the front setback area. My fence posts needed to be repainted to match approved color schemes. I remember laughing when I first read it. The whole thing seemed ridiculous. I'd been living here for 18 years and suddenly I was getting violations for things that had been there since before most of these HOA people even moved to the area. I figured it was some kind of mistake. Maybe a case of mistaken identity. I was wrong. Over the next 6 months, the letters kept coming. My mailbox was the wrong style. My driveway needed to be resurfaced. I had excessive outdoor storage because I kept my tractor in the side yard instead of in the barn. Each violation came with a fine, usually around $200, sometimes more. When I tried to fight them, attending those monthly HOA meetings in the community center that always smelled like old coffee and disappointment, I found myself facing a panel of people who looked at me like I was something they'd scraped off their shoes. The president was a woman named Patricia Henley, who'd moved here from California and seemed to think she could remake our rural community into some kind of suburban paradise. "Mr. Williams," she'd say, in that condescending tone that made my teeth clench, "we're simply trying to maintain property values for everyone. Surely you can understand that." What I understood was that I was being targeted. Other properties in the area had barns and vegetable gardens and tractors, but somehow I was the only one getting violation notices. When I pointed this out, Patricia would just smile that cold smile and say that all properties would eventually be brought into compliance. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was having my coffee on the front porch, watching the sunrise over the pasture, when a sheriff's deputy pulled into my driveway. He was a young guy, probably not even 30, and he looked uncomfortable as he walked up to the house. "Mr. Williams, I'm Deputy Martinez. I have a court order here." The papers he handed me might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the legal jargon they contained, but the bottom line was clear enough. The HOA was placing a lien on my property for unpaid fines and fees totaling $18,700. If I didn't pay within 30 days, they could force a sale. That's when I found out Martha's role in all of this. My lawyer, a good man named Robert Chen, who'd been handling small-town legal matters for 30 years, discovered that Martha had been attending HOA meetings during our divorce proceedings. She'd been the one who pointed out the violations on my property. She'd been the one who suggested that my farm was bringing down the neighborhood character. "Dennis," Robert told me during one of our meetings in his cramped office above the hardware store. "I've seen vindictive divorces before, but this is something else. Your ex-wife essentially weaponized the HOA against you." The worst part wasn't even Martha's betrayal. It was Paul's reaction when I told him what was happening. I'd driven to his house in town, a nice 2-story colonial that his wife Karen had picked out, hoping my son would stand with me against this injustice. Instead, I found myself sitting in his living room, being lectured about how maybe this was an opportunity. "Dad, you're 61 years old," Paul had said, not even looking at me as he scrolled through his phone. "Maybe it's time to think about downsizing. That farm is too much work for someone your age anyway." "It's not too much work for me," I'd insisted, "and it's my home." Karen had chimed in then, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "Dennis, we just want what's best for you. There are some lovely senior communities nearby. You'd have people to talk to, activities to keep you busy. You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or yard work or any of that." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and realized he wasn't the boy I'd taught to fish in the creek that ran through the back 40. He wasn't the teenager who'd helped me rebuild the barn after the tornado in '98. Somewhere along the way, he'd become a stranger who saw his father as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be supported. "What about the farm?" I'd asked. "This is your inheritance, Paul. This land has been in our family for almost 20 years. Paul finally looked up from his phone, and the expression on his face was one I'd never forget. It wasn't angry or sad or even apologetic. It was just indifferent. "Dad, land like that isn't really an investment anymore. The HOA situation just proves it's more trouble than it's worth. If you sell now, you can get something out of it and move somewhere more appropriate for your stage of life." That night, I drove home in the dark, past the mailbox where I'd taught Paul to change the numbers when we moved here, past the oak tree where I'd hung a tire swing for him when he was 8, and I made a decision. I wasn't giving up. Not on the farm, not on the life I'd built, not on the principles I'd tried to teach my son about fighting for what's right. It took 3 years, most of my savings, and more stress than any man should have to endure at my age. But I won. The court found that the HOA had been selectively enforcing regulations and that their actions constituted harassment. I got my farm back, free and clear of all liens and violations. But victory, I was learning, could be its own kind of loneliness. The next morning I called Paul back before I lost my nerve. I'd spent the night rehearsing what I might say, how I might explain the hurt I felt about them missing my celebration, but when he answered the phone, his tone was all business. "Dad, thanks for calling back. Karen and I have been talking, and we think we need to have a family meeting about your situation." My situation. As if getting my farm back was somehow a problem that needed solving. "What kind of situation are we talking about, Paul?" "Look, can you come over tonight? Mom will be here too. We all need to discuss this together." Martha. Of course Martha would be involved. The woman who'd tried to destroy everything I'd worked for was now going to be part of a family meeting about my property. I wanted to hang up right then, but something in Paul's voice stopped me. There was an urgency there that made my stomach twist with worry. "Is everything okay? Is someone sick? Just come over at 7. We'll explain everything then." I spent the rest of the day working around the farm, trying to keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't spiral into dark places. I fixed the loose board on the front porch steps, cleaned out the gutters that had been bothering me for weeks, and spent an hour just sitting on the back fence watching the neighbors' cattle graze in the distance. This land, this view, this peace. It was what I'd fought so hard to keep. Paul's house sat in one of those newer subdivisions where every home looked like it had been stamped out with the same cookie cutter. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, driveways so clean you could eat off them. It was everything my farm wasn't, and I suspected that was exactly the point. Karen answered the door with that same artificial smile she'd perfected over the years. "Dennis, come in, come in. Everyone's in the living room." Martha was sitting on the couch like she owned the place, which always rubbed me the wrong way. She'd chosen to leave our marriage, chosen to try to destroy my farm, but somehow she still got to be part of family decisions. She looked older than I remembered, her hair more gray than brown now, but her eyes still held that calculating look that had made the last years of our marriage feel like living with a chess player who was always 3 moves ahead. "Hello, Dennis," she said, not getting up. "Congratulations on winning your little legal battle." Little legal battle, as if 3 years of hell had been some minor inconvenience. Paul gestured for me to sit in the chair across from them, and I realized I was being positioned like I was about to face a tribunal. Karen sat down next to Martha, and Paul remained standing, which somehow made the whole scene feel even more formal and uncomfortable. "Dad," Paul began, We've been doing some research, and we're concerned about your long-term financial situation. I frowned. What do you mean? I'm fine financially. Are you, though? Martha interjected. Dennis, you spent almost everything you had fighting the HOA. Your lawyer bills alone were what, $50,000? $60,000, $53,000, I said quietly. It had been worth every penny, but hearing the number out loud still made my chest tight. See? Karen said, leaning forward like she was talking to a child. And now you're living alone on this big property with all the maintenance costs, property taxes, utility bills for a house that's way too big for one person. The house isn't too big for me. Dad, be realistic, Paul said. You're 64 years old. What happens when you can't maintain the property anymore? What happens if you get sick? What if you fall and there's nobody around to help you? I looked around the room at these three people who were supposed to care about me, and all I saw were vultures circling a wounded animal. What exactly are you suggesting? Martha and Karen exchanged a look, and I knew I was about to hear something I wouldn't like. We think you should sell the farm, Martha said, while you can still get good money for it. The words hit me like a physical blow. Sell the farm. Think about it logically, Dennis, Paul said, starting to pace. Real estate prices are good right now. You could probably get $400,000, maybe more, for the property. That money could set you up in a nice senior living community, and you'd still have plenty left over for your retirement. I don't want to live in a senior community, but you might need to eventually, Karen said gently. Wouldn't it be better to make that choice now, while you're healthy and thinking clearly, rather than waiting until it becomes an emergency? I stood up abruptly, needing to move, needing to do something with the anger that was building in my chest. I just spent 3 years fighting to keep that farm. 3 years and everything I had, because it's my home. And now you want me to sell it? Dad, sit down, Paul said. Let's talk about this rationally. Rationally, I turned to face my son, this man I'd raised to believe in fighting for what's right. You want rational? Here's rational. I'm 64, not 94. I'm healthy, I'm capable, and I love my land. Rationally, I should be able to live there as long as I want to. But what about the money? Martha asked. Dennis, you have no savings left, no retirement fund. What are you going to live on? I have my Social Security starting in a few months. I have the farm paid off. I can grow my own food, and my expenses are low. That's not enough, Paul said. What if you need medical care? What if something happens to the house? What if your truck breaks down and you need a new one? They had answers for everything, solutions for problems I hadn't even considered. But as I listened to them talk about my future like I wasn't even in the room, I began to understand what was really happening here. Where's this concern coming from all of a sudden? I asked. 3 years ago, when I was fighting for my farm, where were all of you? Paul, you told me I should just give up and move to a senior community then too. Martha, you were the one who helped the HOA try to take my land in the first place. Martha had the grace to look uncomfortable. That was different. How was it different? We were divorced. I was angry. People do things when they're angry that they later regret. Do you regret it? She was quiet for a long moment. I regret that it caused you pain. Not quite an apology, but the closest thing to one I was likely to get from Martha. But that doesn't change the current situation, Paul said. Dad, we're trying to help you plan for your future. No, I said slowly, the pieces finally clicking together in my mind. You're trying to plan for your future. The room went quiet. Karen looked down at her hands. Martha's jaw tightened. Paul stopped pacing. What do you mean by that? Paul asked, but his voice had changed. The practiced concern was gone, replaced by something defensive. I mean that if I sell the farm, there's money. Money that might someday be inherited. Money that might be available sooner if I'm living somewhere with lower expenses. I sat back down, but this time I felt like I was in control of the conversation. But if I keep the farm and live there until I die, there's no windfall, just a piece of property that might or might not be worth anything by then. Dad, that's not fair, Paul said. We're genuinely worried about you. Are you? Because funny thing, your concern about my well-being seems to have started right around the time I got my farm back. Martha stood up suddenly. Dennis, I think you're being paranoid. We're your family. We want what's best for you. Really? Then where were you yesterday? I threw a party to celebrate the biggest victory of my life, and not one of you showed up. But now, less than 24 hours later, you're all here wanting to talk about my property. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Finally, Karen cleared her throat. Dennis, I know yesterday was important to you and I'm sorry we missed it. But this conversation isn't about money. It's about making sure you're safe and cared for as you get older. I looked at this woman who'd married my son, this woman who'd never lived anywhere but suburbs and shopping centers, trying to tell me what was best for my life. And I realized that no matter what I said, no matter how I explained it, they would never understand what that farm meant to me. I appreciate your concern, I said, standing up again. But I'm not selling. The farm is my home, and that's where I'm going to stay. Paul's face darkened. Dad, you're being stubborn. We're trying to help you, and you're acting like we're the enemy. I'm not acting like anything. I'm just making my own decisions about my own life. As I drove home that night, past the fence posts I'd set myself and the mailbox Paul had helped me install when he was 12, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. My family wasn't trying to help me. They were trying to manage me. And that realization hurt worse than all the HOA violations and court battles combined. Something about that family meeting wouldn't leave me alone. Over the next few days, I kept replaying the conversation in my head, picking apart every word, every glance that passed between Martha, Paul, and Karen. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that there was something they weren't telling me. It started with small things. Martha mentioning that she'd been doing research about my financial situation. How would she know anything about my finances? We'd been divorced for 4 years, and I certainly hadn't shared that information with her. Then there was the way Karen and Paul had exchanged looks when I'd asked direct questions, like they were communicating in some code I wasn't supposed to understand. But what really bothered me was the timing. Why now? Why, immediately after I won my legal battle and got my farm back, was everyone suddenly so concerned about my ability to live independently? I decided to do some research of my own. My first stop was Robert Chen's office. If anyone would know what was really going on, it would be my lawyer. He'd handled my divorce from Martha, fought the HOA case, and had access to all the legal documents that had been flying around for the past few years. "Dennis," Robert said when I walked into his office that Thursday morning, "you look troubled. Is everything okay?" I told him about the family meeting, about their sudden push for me to sell the farm, about the feeling that something wasn't adding up. Robert listened quietly, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad, his expression growing more serious as I talked. "I want to ask you something that might sound paranoid," I said finally. "Is there any way Martha or Paul could have been involved in more than just pointing out violations to the HOA? Could they have been actively working to help the HOA take my property?" Robert set down his pen and looked at me for a long moment. "What makes you ask that?" "Just a feeling. The timing of everything. The way they're acting now. I keep thinking about how Martha seemed to know exactly which violations would cause me the most trouble." "Dennis, I have to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you really want to know the truth about what happened during the HOA case? Because once I tell you, there's no going back to not knowing." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Robert pulled out a thick file folder that I recognized. It contained all the documents from my case against the HOA. During the discovery process, we obtained records of all HOA meetings, correspondence, and financial transactions going back 5 years. Most of it was routine, but there were a few things that struck me as odd at the time. He opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. "These are minutes from HOA board meetings during the time when your violations were being issued. Look at this entry from October 15 of last year." I put on my reading glasses and squinted at the document. The handwriting was neat and official, recording the basic business of the meeting, budget discussions, maintenance issues, new violation reports. But there, in the middle of the page, was something that made my blood run cold. Board member Patricia Henley reported that she had been contacted by a concerned community member regarding ongoing violations at 147 Oakwood Road. The community member provided photographic evidence of violations and suggested that immediate action was necessary to maintain neighborhood standards. 147 Oakwood Road, my address. "Who was the community member?" I asked, though I was already starting to suspect the answer. Robert turned the page. The name isn't listed in the official minutes, but I found this in Patricia Henley's personal notes, which we subpoenaed. He handed me another document, this one handwritten in loose cursive. Meeting with Martha Williams, October 12. She provided photos of property violations at her former residence and expressed concern about impact on neighborhood property values. Agreed to provide additional documentation as needed. I read the note 3 times before the full meaning sank in. Martha hadn't just casually mentioned my supposed violations to the HOA. She had arranged a formal meeting with the board president. She had provided photographs, which meant she had been on my property taking pictures specifically to build a case against me. There's more, Robert said gently. He pulled out another set of documents, financial records from the HOA's legal fund. They sued a lot of property owners during this time period, but most cases settled quickly. Your case was different. They spent an unusual amount of money fighting it. Almost $43,000 in legal fees. Why would they spend so much? That's what I wondered too, so I looked into where that money came from. Robert handed me a bank record. The HOA received several anonymous donations to their legal fund during the time they were pursuing your case. 3 donations of $5,000 each and 1 donation of $10,000. All cash deposits, all untraceable, $25,000. Someone had funded the HOA's campaign against me. Robert, I said slowly, do you think Martha could have been the source of these donations? I can't prove it legally. The donations were structured to be anonymous. But Dennis, he hesitated, then pulled out one more document. This is a bank record I obtained through a different case, a divorce proceeding where I needed to trace hidden assets. It's Martha's account from that same time period. I looked at the bank statement, and there they were. 4 cash withdrawals that matched exactly with the anonymous donations to the HOA. $5,000 on August 3rd, $5,000 on September 14th, $5,000 on October 20th, $10,000 on November 8th. She funded them, I whispered. She paid the HOA to sue me. It looks that way. And Dennis, there's something else you need to see. Robert reached into the folder one more time and pulled out a real estate document. This is a purchase offer that was submitted to the HOA during your case. Someone wanted to buy your property directly from them if they succeeded in forcing the sale. I took the document with trembling hands. The offer was for $275,000, well below market value for my 160-acre farm. The buyer was listed as Meadowbrook Development, LLC. I've never heard of that company, I said. Neither had I, so I did some research. Meadowbrook Development, LLC was incorporated 6 months before your HOA trouble started. The registered owner is Paul Williams. The room started spinning. I gripped the edge of Robert's desk to keep from falling out of my chair. Paul tried to buy my farm from the HOA? At a significant discount, yes. If the HOA had succeeded in forcing a sale for unpaid fines, your son's company would have purchased the property for about 60% of its actual value. I stared at the document, reading Paul's name over and over again. My own son. The boy I'd taught to drive in that very pasture. The young man I'd helped through college, who I'd walked down the aisle at his wedding, who had grandchildren carrying my name. Dennis, I'm sorry, Robert said softly. I debated whether to tell you about this. I knew it would be painful. How long have you known? I discovered it about 6 months ago, during the final stages of your case. By then we were already winning, and I didn't want to distract you with family drama. But given what you've told me about their recent behavior, I sat there in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what I'd learned. Martha hadn't just betrayed me during our divorce. She had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to steal my farm. And Paul hadn't just been unsupportive during my legal battle. He had been actively working against me, hoping to profit from my downfall. Is there more? I asked. Robert nodded grimly. Phone records. During the time when violations were being reported most heavily, there were frequent calls between Martha's number, Paul's number, and Patricia Henley's direct line, sometimes multiple calls per day. They had been coordinating, planning, probably celebrating every violation notice I received, every fine that pushed me closer to losing everything. Why would they do this? I asked, though even as I said it, I knew the answer. Money. My farm was valuable, and they saw an opportunity to get it at a bargain price. There's one more thing, Robert said. After you won your case and got the farm back, Paul dissolved Meadowbrook Development LLC, but just last week he incorporated a new company. This one is called Heritage Holdings LLC. What does that mean? I think it means they haven't given up. I think yesterday's family meeting was Plan B. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd learned. Every conversation with Paul over the past 3 years took on a new meaning. Every time he'd suggested I should just give up and sell, every time he'd made me feel like I was being stubborn and unreasonable, he had been protecting his own investment in seeing me fail. And Martha, the woman I'd been married to for 19 years, who had shared my bed and my dreams and my struggles, had systematically planned to destroy me, not in a moment of anger or hurt, but methodically, deliberately, over a period of months. As I pulled into my driveway and looked at my farm, my home, the place I'd nearly lost to their greed, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharper than ever, but underneath it was something else, something harder and colder and more determined than I'd felt in years. They thought they could manipulate me into selling because they saw me as a lonely old man who would eventually give in to family pressure. They were counting on my love for Paul to make me vulnerable to their schemes. They had made a serious miscalculation. I spent the weekend planning, not planning revenge, that wasn't my style, but planning justice. There's a difference, and it mattered to me that what I was about to do was right, not just satisfying. On Monday morning, I drove to the office of Sarah Martinez, an estate planning attorney that Robert had recommended. Sarah was younger than I'd expected, probably in her 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense way of speaking that I appreciated immediately. "Mr. Williams," she said after I'd explained my situation, "what you're describing is unfortunately more common than you might think. Family members who see elderly relatives as obstacles to inheritance rather than people to be loved and protected. I'm not elderly," I said automatically, then caught myself. "Sorry, I know I'm getting older, but I'm not helpless. Of course not. But perception matters, and it sounds like your family has decided you're incapable of making your own decisions." She leaned back in her chair. "Tell me what you want to accomplish." "I want to make sure my farm goes to people who will actually appreciate it and use it for good. And I want to make sure that the people who tried to steal it from me understand there are consequences for their actions." Sarah smiled. "I think we can arrange that." It took 3 meetings over 2 weeks to set everything up properly. Sarah was thorough, making sure every detail was legally sound, and that there would be no way for Paul or Martha to challenge what I was doing. We discussed various options, conservation easements, charitable trusts, outright donations, before settling on the perfect solution. The American Veterans Land Trust had been on my radar for years. They worked with military families to preserve rural land and provide transitional housing for veterans struggling to readjust to civilian life. My farm would be perfect for their programs, large enough to house several families with good soil for agricultural therapy programs, and far enough from the city to provide the peace and quiet that many veterans needed. But the truly beautiful part of Sarah's plan was the timing. Instead of waiting until I died to transfer ownership, I would donate the farm immediately to the trust with a life estate agreement. That meant I could continue living there for the rest of my life, but the property would legally belong to the Veterans Organization starting right away. Paul would have no inheritance to claim, and there would be no property for Heritage Holdings LLC to purchase. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked as we sat in her office on a Tuesday morning, the final papers spread out on her desk. "Once we file these documents, there's no changing your mind. Your son will never inherit this property." I thought about Paul as a little boy, running through the pasture with our old dog Rex, helping me fix fence posts and complaining about having to stack hay bales. I thought about the young man who'd called me from college every Sunday night, who'd brought his first girlfriend home to meet me, who'd asked my blessing before he proposed to Karen. Then I thought about Meadowbrook Development LLC, about phone calls coordinating with the HOA, about anonymous donations funding a legal campaign designed to steal my home. "I'm sure," I said, and signed the papers. The next phase of my plan required more delicate timing. I needed my family to reveal their true intentions completely before I revealed mine, so I called Paul and asked if we could have another family meeting. "Dad, I'm glad you called," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "We were hoping you'd had time to think about our conversation." "I have been thinking about it." "Can everyone meet here at the farm on Saturday afternoon? I'd like to cook dinner for you all." There was a pause. "At the farm? Dad, wouldn't it be easier to meet at our house again?" "No, I think it's important that we have this conversation on my property. After all, that's what we're discussing. Paul agreed, though I could hear the reluctance in his voice. I spent Friday cleaning the house and preparing a meal that would have made my mother proud. Pot roast with vegetables from my garden, fresh bread, apple pie made from fruit off my own trees. If this was going to be the last time I cooked for my family, I wanted it to be memorable. Saturday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly, which seemed appropriate for what I was about to do. Martha arrived first, driving the same sedan she'd gotten in the divorce settlement. She looked nervous as she walked up to the front door, like she was entering enemy territory. "Dennis," she said when I opened the door. "Thank you for inviting me." "I know this is awkward. It doesn't have to be awkward if everyone's honest," I replied, which seemed to make her even more uncomfortable. Paul and Karen arrived 20 minutes later with their 2 kids, Emma and Jake. They were good kids, 9 and 11 years old, and they ran straight to me for hugs like they always did. For a moment, watching them explore the house they'd always loved visiting, I almost lost my resolve. But then I caught Paul's eye and saw him assessing the property like he was already measuring it for development. "Dad, the place looks great," Karen said, though her tone suggested she was surprised. "You're managing the upkeep really well." "I manage fine," I said. "Come on, dinner's ready." We sat around my kitchen table, the same table where Martha and I had shared thousands of meals during our marriage, where Paul had done homework as a boy. The conversation was strained but polite as we ate. Emma chattered about school. Jake showed me a drawing he'd made of the farm, and for brief moments it almost felt like a normal family dinner. But I could see the adults exchanging meaningful looks over the children's heads. This wasn't a social visit. They were here for business. After dessert, Martha suggested that maybe the kids could watch a movie in the living room while the adults talked. As soon as Emma and Jake were settled in front of the television, the atmosphere in the kitchen changed completely. "Dad," Paul began, "Karen and I have been doing more research about your options, and we think we've found the perfect solution." He pulled out a folder of brochures and printouts: senior living communities, retirement villages, assisted living facilities. All of them looked like resorts in the photographs, with smiling elderly people playing golf and attending craft classes. "Look at this one," Karen said, pointing to a glossy brochure. "Sunset Manor is only 30 minutes from our house, so we could visit all the time. They have a dining room, social activities, a medical center right on site. You wouldn't have to worry about anything." "And the best part," Martha added, "is that most of these places have buy-in fees instead of monthly rent. So you'd use the money from selling the farm to secure your spot, and then your monthly expenses would be minimal." I studied the brochures, noting the prices listed in small print at the bottom. Buy-in fees ranging from $300,000 to $500,000, almost exactly what my farm was worth. "These look very nice," I said, "but I'm curious about something. If I sell the farm and use all the money for a buy-in fee, what happens to my estate? What happens to the inheritance I always planned to leave Paul?" The 3 of them exchanged glances, and I could see them trying to figure out how to answer that question without revealing their real motives. "Dad, you don't need to worry about leaving us an inheritance," Paul said finally. "We just want you to be comfortable and safe." "But theoretically, if I moved to one of these places, there wouldn't be much left to inherit, would there?" "Well, no," Martha admitted. "But Dennis, you shouldn't be making decisions based on what you're leaving behind. You should be focused on living your best life now." I nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right. I should be focused on living my best life, which is why I've made a decision." They all leaned forward expectantly. "I'm not selling the farm." Paul's face darkened immediately. "Dad, we've been through this. Let me finish," I said calmly. "I'm not selling the farm, and I'm not moving to a retirement community. But I have made some changes to my estate planning that I think you should know about." I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter where I'd placed a folder containing copies of all the legal documents Sarah had prepared. "I've donated the farm to the American Veterans Land Trust." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the old clock ticking on the wall. Martha's face went pale. Karen's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to speak but couldn't form words. Paul just stared at me. "What do you mean, donated?" Paul finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, I've given it away. The farm now belongs to a veterans organization that will use it to help military families transition back to civilian life. I have a life estate, so I can live here until I die. But after that, it belongs to them permanently." "You can't do that," Martha said, her voice shaking. "You can't just give away property without consulting your family." "Actually, I can. It's my property, and I can do whatever I want with it." Paul stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. "Dad, do you have any idea what you've just done? Do you know how much that property is worth? About $450,000, according to the latest appraisal. It's going to help a lot of veterans." "That was my inheritance," Paul shouted, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. "That farm was supposed to be mine someday." "Your inheritance?" I kept my voice calm, though my heart was pounding. "Paul, you never showed any interest in this farm except to tell me I should sell it." "Because I thought it would be better for you financially. I was trying to help you." "Were you? Or were you trying to help yourself?" Karen was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "Dennis, how could you do this to us? We've been trying so hard to take care of you, and this is how you repay us?" "Take care of me?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what you call it?" I opened my folder and pulled out copies of the documents Robert had shown me. Bank records, corporation filings, phone logs. I spread them across the kitchen table like playing cards. "Paul, would you like to explain to your wife what Meadowbrook Development LLC was?" The color drained from Paul's face. Martha made a small choking sound. "I don't know what you're talking about," Paul said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It was your company. The company that tried to buy my farm from the HOA when they were foreclosing on it for $275,000. Quite a bargain, don't you think?" Karen looked back and forth between Paul and the documents on the table. "Paul, what is he talking about?" "And Martha," I continued, "those anonymous donations to the HOA's legal fund, $5,000, $5,000, $5,000, and $10,000. They match your bank withdrawals exactly." Martha's hands were shaking. "Dennis, I can explain. Can you? Can you explain why my own wife and son conspired to steal my home? Can you explain why you funded a legal campaign designed to destroy me financially?" Paul slumped back into his chair, his head in his hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "How is it supposed to happen, son?" We thought if the HOA took the farm, you'd be forced to make a change. We thought maybe it would be better for everyone if you moved somewhere with people around, somewhere safer. And if I bought the property, at least it would stay in the family. At 60% of its value. We would have taken care of you with the savings. We would have made sure you had everything you needed." I looked at this man who shared my name, my blood, my face when he was younger, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd failed as a father. I'd raised a son who thought it was acceptable to steal from his own parent as long as he convinced himself it was for my own good. "Get out," I said quietly. "Dad, all of you, get your children and leave my property." Martha started to protest, but I held up my hand. "You have no right to be here. You have no claim on anything I own, and you have no place in my life anymore." As they gathered their things and called the children, Paul made one last attempt. "Dad, this doesn't have to be permanent. We can work this out. We're still family." I looked at him standing in my doorway, the same doorway he'd run through as a child coming home from school, and I felt something break inside my chest. Not break with pain, but break free. "No, Paul, we're not family anymore. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't lie and conspire and try to destroy each other's lives. What you and your mother did to me, that's not what family does." After they left, I sat on my front porch and watched their taillights disappear down the road. The rain had stopped, and the evening sky was clearing. In the distance, I could see the lights coming on in my neighbor's house, and I could hear cattle lowing in the pasture. For the first time in years, my farm felt peaceful. 6 months later, I was sitting on that same front porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold over my pasture, when the first van pulled up my driveway. I'd been expecting them, of course. The American Veterans Land Trust had been coordinating with me for weeks about the arrival of the first family. Tommy Rodriguez stepped out of the driver's seat, a young man about Paul's age with kind eyes, and the careful way of moving that I recognized in a lot of veterans. His wife Sarah emerged from the passenger side, holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. "Mr. Williams?" Tommy called out as they approached the porch. "We're the Rodriguez family. Thank you so much for this opportunity." I stood up and walked down to meet them, shaking Tommy's hand and smiling at his daughter, who hid behind her mother's legs. "Welcome to the farm. I hope you'll be happy here." Over the next few hours, I helped them get settled in the old foreman's cabin that we'd renovated for exactly this purpose. It had been empty for years, but with some work and a lot of help from the Veterans Organization, we'd turned it into a comfortable home for a family of 3. Tommy had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and was struggling with PTSD. The isolation and peace of farm life, the organization's counselors had explained, would be therapeutic for him. As the weeks passed, more families arrived. The Hendersons, who moved into the converted barn apartment. The Washingtons, who took over the small house near the back pasture that I'd originally built as a guest house but never used. Each family brought their own stories, their own struggles, their own hopes for healing. What I hadn't expected was how much their presence would heal me too. Tommy turned out to have a gift for working with animals. Within a month, he'd convinced me to let him bring in a few head of cattle to graze the pasture that had been sitting empty since my divorce. Sarah started a vegetable garden that put my own modest efforts to shame, and little Maria, their daughter, appointed herself official egg collector when we got chickens. In the evenings, we'd often gather on my front porch, the adults talking while the children played in the yard. These conversations were nothing like the tense, agenda-driven meetings I'd endured with my own family. These people actually listened to each other. They cared about each other's problems without trying to solve them or profit from them. "Mr. Williams," Tommy said one evening as we watched Maria chase fireflies, "can I ask you something personal?" "Course you can." "Why did you give up your inheritance to help us? I mean, we're grateful beyond words, but this place must be worth a fortune. Didn't you have family who expected to inherit it?" I was quiet for a long moment, watching Sarah help Maria catch a firefly in a mason jar. "I had a son who expected to inherit it," I said finally. "But expecting and deserving are 2 different things." Tommy nodded like he understood, though I didn't elaborate. I'd never told any of the families about Paul and Martha and what they'd tried to do to me. That was my burden to carry, not theirs. But as months turned into a year, then 2 years, I began to realize that I hadn't lost a family when I cut ties with Paul and Martha. I'd gained one, a chosen family of people who understood loyalty and sacrifice and the importance of having a place to call home. The farm flourished under their care in ways it never had when I was managing it alone. Tommy's cattle operation grew into a profitable side business that helped fund the veterans programs. Sarah's garden supplied fresh produce to the local farmers market. The Hendersons started a woodworking shop in the old machinery shed, creating beautiful furniture that they sold online. The Washingtons opened a small mechanic shop that served the rural community. My role evolved from landowner to something more like a grandfather figure. I helped with childcare when parents had appointments or needed to work. I shared my knowledge of the land, the seasons, the quirks of the old house and outbuildings. In return, they included me in their lives in ways that felt natural and unforced. I did hear from Paul occasionally, text messages mostly, sent late at night when I imagined he'd been drinking and thinking about what he'd lost. "Dad, I'm sorry. Can we talk?" "Dad, the kids miss their grandpa." "Dad, I know I made mistakes, but we're still family." I never responded. Sarah Martinez, my attorney, had advised me that any contact with Paul could be seen as an invitation to contest the land donation or claim that I'd been coerced. But more than that, I simply had nothing to say to him. The man who could conspire to steal his father's home wasn't someone I wanted in my life, blood relation or not. Martha, on the other hand, seemed to have disappeared entirely. I heard through the small-town gossip network that she'd moved to Florida, supposedly to be closer to her sister. Good riddance, I thought, though I was surprised to find that I felt no anger toward her anymore. Just nothing. The real test of my decision came in my 3rd year on the farm, when I had what the doctors called a minor heart attack. Tommy found me collapsed in the pasture where I'd been checking on a sick calf, and Sarah rode with me in the ambulance to the hospital. For 3 days, the entire extended farm family took turns sitting with me, making sure I wasn't alone, bringing me books and magazines and homemade cookies. Paul never showed up. I don't know if he even knew I was sick. When I got home from the hospital, weak but determined to recover, I found that Tommy had moved a bed into my living room so I wouldn't have to climb stairs for a few weeks. Sarah had meal prepped enough food to last me a month. The children had made get-well cards that covered my kitchen table. "This is what family looks like," I thought as I sat surrounded by these people who had chosen to care about an old man they'd known for only a few years. My recovery was slow but steady. The heart attack had been a warning, the cardiologist explained, but not a death sentence. With medication and lifestyle changes, I could expect to live several more years. The key, he said, is avoiding stress and maintaining social connections. Isolation is one of the biggest risk factors for elderly cardiac patients. I almost laughed at that. 6 months ago, I'd been isolated, estranged from my family, facing the prospect of growing old alone on a property that felt more like a burden than a blessing. Now I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my well-being, living on a farm that buzzed with activity and purpose every single day. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch recovering from my illness, I saw a familiar car coming up the driveway. My chest tightened with anxiety until I realized it wasn't Paul's sedan. It was Robert Chen's hybrid. "Dennis," he said as he climbed the porch steps. "You look good. How are you feeling?" "Better every day. What brings you out here?" Robert sat down in the chair next to mine and pulled out a folder. "I wanted to update you on something. Paul filed a legal challenge to your land donation." My heart sank. Can he do that? He tried. "Claimed you were mentally incompetent when you made the decision, that you were coerced by the veterans organization, that the donation was made under duress." Robert smiled. The judge threw it out, told Paul's lawyer that it was one of the most obviously frivolous cases he'd ever seen. "So it's over? Completely. The donation is permanent and uncontestable. This farm will belong to the Veterans Trust forever." Relief flooded through me, followed by a deep satisfaction that I'd never experienced before. Paul had made one last attempt to steal my legacy, and he'd failed completely. "There's something else," Robert continued. The judge was apparently pretty angry about the frivolous lawsuit. He ordered Paul to pay the court costs and the Veterans Organization's legal fees, about $15,000 total. I couldn't help but smile at that. Justice had a sense of humor sometimes. As Robert drove away, I sat on the porch listening to the familiar sounds of my farm. Tommy's cattle lowing in the distance. Sarah calling her children in for dinner. The Hendersons' oldest son practicing guitar in their apartment. The sound of home, of family, of a life well lived. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Paul's number. For a moment, I considered calling him. Not to reconcile, that bridge had been burned beyond repair, but maybe to explain why I'd made the choices I had. Maybe to give him one last chance to understand what family really means. But then Maria Rodriguez came running up to the porch, breathless with excitement. "Grandpa Dennis! Grandpa Dennis! Come see the baby calf. She's so little and cute, and Tommy says I can name her." I put my phone away and let this little girl who shared no blood with me but had claimed me as family lead me to the pasture. The baby calf was indeed small and cute, all legs and curiosity, staying close to her mother but brave enough to sniff my outstretched hand. "What do you think we should name her?" I asked Maria. She considered this seriously, her face scrunched up in concentration. "Hope," she said finally. "Because Tommy says she represents hope for the future of our farm. Our farm. Not my farm, not the veterans' farm, but our farm. This child understood something that my own son never had. That belonging isn't about ownership or inheritance or legal documents. It's about love and care and showing up for each other when it matters." "Hope is a perfect name," I said, and meant it. As we walked back to the house for dinner, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete and total peace. Not the peace of victory or revenge, but the peace of knowing that I'd made the right choices. The peace of being surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not what I could give them. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that never got old no matter how many times I'd seen them. My farm, our farm, was alive with the sounds of families living their lives, healing from their wounds, building something beautiful together. I'd given up my inheritance to spite a son who'd betrayed me, but in return, I'd gained something much more valuable. I'd gained the knowledge that the life I'd built meant something, that the choices I'd made would echo forward in ways that would help people long after I was gone. And when my time came, whether that was next year or 10 years from now, I would die knowing that I'd spent my final years surrounded by love, not by people counting down the days until they could claim their inheritance. Some victories are worth more than money. Some families are worth more than blood. And sometimes, the best way to win is to give everything away to people who will actually treasure it. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without dreams of battles fought or losses mourned. I slept the deep, peaceful sleep of a man who had finally found his way home.